Sometimes you look for an excuse to make some kind of a gesture. As for Haiti, I just think I would have loved to see the U.S. take on Haiti as a project at the beginning. Haiti is a great shame for the whole Western Hemisphere. It should be a hemispheric project. And I think there's great potential there, not just for Haiti, but for the entire Western Hemisphere to work together on a project in which the United States would not seek to dominate, but would just want to be a partner. But I don't see what would drive a decision in the second year that wasn't there in the first year. If there was a feeling in Washington, we need to do something for Haiti, but we need an excuse to do it, well, the earthquake would have been the perfect one. So I don't see something dramatic. I could see some incremental, very small changes in relations with Cuba, but not what most of us had expected. And the Cuba thing is kind of odd to me because there's not so much political cost anymore. You don't automatically lose the Florida vote if you say something about restoring relations with Cuba. As to why the administration has not focused more on Latin America, maybe it's because the squeaky wheel gets the oil, that there seems to be a lot of crises in the world, and Latin America is not in too much crisis. But I'll tell you this. I once wrote a column about the invasion of Iraq, in which I posited that almost everybody lost in the invasion of Iraq. Iraq lost, the United States lost, and all these different factions lost. The only winner of the Iraq war was Iran. We essentially turned Iraq over to Iran as a gift, the country that we claim to hate so much. So I wrote this column. There were no winners of the Iraq war other than Iran. And I got a couple of emails from friends of mine in Latin America, and they said, "You're wrong. We were the winners. Latin America won the Iraq war because while America was so focused on Iraq and Afghanistan and not being able to chew gum and walk at the same time, they were not focused on us anymore. And therefore, nationalist regimes have been able to come to power in half of Latin America, and the United States would have never allowed this to happen if it wasn't so preoccupied with the Middle East." So maybe there was something good that came out of it. Yes? Well, I would say that what we're essentially doing is adjusting to reality. That's the way I would sell it. It's not that we've decided, we could rule the world, but we don't want to anymore. That's not what it's about. It's just accepting what is happening in the world and not keep living in a fantasy world. The United States is not able to resolve the world's great problems by itself. The world's great problems are so transnational now, whether it's pandemics or terrorism or global warming. These are problems that require international cooperation. Now, I said early in my talk that toughness is the -- virtue in this foreign policy establishment in Washington. When you try to introduce realism into the debate, you're automatically vulnerable. You are being accused of being a defeatist, a declinist, ever hear that word? And worst of all, an isolationist. Actually, what we're trying to do is bring the United States to a point where it's best able to achieve its long-term goals. That's the way that I would sell it. America needs to start focusing on the long term, particularly in foreign policy. I think one reason we don't do this, among many other reasons, is that we're a very young country. We're like a young kid. When I was 9 years old, I knew everything. Now I'm ignorant. We're at the 9-year-old stage in the American history development. I mean, Iran has been around 10 times longer than the United States as a country. And there are many civilizations. China is another example. I had a chat with one Chinese diplomat, and I started talking about the last 100 years in China and how awful it's been. Just you know, they had the Opium Wars, and the British took over, and then you had this dictatorship and this horrific civil war, and then you had this cultural revolution and millions killed, and what a horrible time China's had. And he kind of smiled in a bemused way, and he said, it was nothing, we just had a bad century. No problem. Maybe we'll have maybe one more bad one, and then we're going to have some good ones. Now, when you've been around for 50 centuries, you can start to look at things that way. But the United States doesn't do that. The first mahogany planter from the U.S. that went to work in Central America was he actually went there to grow bananas, but he got interested in the mahogany idea, and he planted the first few mahogany trees, and people asked him, so how long does it take for the first mahogany tree to grow to maturity? And he said, 100 years. Everybody was shocked. Well, what are you doing it for? He won't even be here. Yeah, but that's not what it's about. Someone's got to do it now. We don't think that way. So the way I would sell it is, let's think about what's in America's interest. What's going to preserve as much as we can of our power in the world 50 and 100 years from now. Let's not think about short-term goals. I think that would be, if you could sell it at all, the way to try to do it. Yes?
In your book, All the Shah's Men, you talk about how communication was really important in terms of building that kind of democratic movement, starting with the tobacco revolt.
Oh, yeah.
And I was wondering what role communication plays now within green movement protests, and how it can be improved, or what role the U.S. could play in improving it.
Well, I think, as we all know, social networking has become the dominant force in bringing the Iranian democratic movement together. This is the first Twitter movement. And it's truly remarkable that, as I said earlier, the internet culture is enormous. I think Farsi is the #4 language after English, Chinese, and Spanish in blogs. In Iran, it's just one little country, so that's quite shows you how focused on this they are. Communication will become extremely important, but the United States is actually impeding the ability of Iranians to communicate with each other in this resistance movement because our sanctions on Iran prevent American computer companies from selling software to ordinary Iranians or making software available to ordinary Iranians that will allow them to get around government censorship. You know, there are very complex computer mechanisms that allow users to get around filters and get around censorship. Actually, there was a column written by my former colleague Roger Cohen in the New York Times electronic edition just within the last week complaining about this, that he's appealing essentially to the Treasury Department. Will you please wake up and realize that you're sanctioning the people in Iran that are fighting for American-style democratic ideals, and you're making it more difficult for them to communicate with each other? So I'd like to see the U.S., with all of its computer abilities and with a number of Iranian Americans working in the computer business, try to focus on how do we help these people communicate. But I want to add one very important caveat. In the collective psyche of Iranians, there is a deep sense that the outside world is always intervening and ruining everything for us. Every time we try to do something, the outside world comes in. And when you are perceived in Iran as an ally or tool of a foreign power, you lose legitimacy. The United States should not publicly be embracing and supporting and encouraging and praising the democratic movement in Iran. That can be the kiss of death. We need to keep our distance. The Iranian movement is something that was built up on its own. It's domestic. It's fully legitimate in the eyes of most Iranians. And we can ruin that for them by embracing them. We should just keep our hands off and realize that processes in the world will mature at their own pace. When the United States comes in to try to accelerate things, we often wind up producing the opposite situation. And for us to start becoming the vocal, outspoken ally and supplier of the democratic movement in Iran would greatly damage that movement's credibility.